Okay, so I guess this is going to be a response to conference report. This is one of Fred's most recent videos, Bloody Sunyata, and I guess I want to say some things about the nature of consciousness and how it does relate to suffering, and to try to get at some of those issues. Which again, I found Fred's video to be just fascinating. The range of concerns that were raised there. I think rather than the metaphor of the phonograph player that Fred used, I guess I would rather go to a kind of classic one, or I mean, I guess I'm a little bit more cliche here, but the issue of a mirror. I mean, a mirror is material, and a mirror is something that is fashioned out of what is available here on the planet, and in that sense, it's fully material. And yet, the mirror itself always presences what it's not. That is, to the person who looks at the mirror, they very, very infrequently look at the mirror. What instead they look at is what the mirror reflects, or the image that's made manifest on the mirror. Now you can, if the mirror is dirty, or if I'm, particularly interested in the kind of glass or the kind of reflective surface, I maybe will just look at the mirror itself. But the mirror as mirror is used because it shows what it isn't. Even though it comes from the material world, it enables a kind of continuous presencing. Now, I think this issue of, does the mirror ever have a contentlessness? Is the mirror ever empty? Well, I mean, not really. I mean, the mirror is always reflecting something. The question is the difference between the mirror and reflecting to the image on the mirror and reflecting to the mirror itself. I think what happens is, in everyday consciousness, it's a fragmented brokenness where it's not simply that we can't get to the mirror that doesn't have something reflecting on it. It's that we're so concerned with the broken reflections of reflections of reflections that include reflections upon the mirror and the broken images that are reflected in there. It's a water that's rippled, and the many ripples are all confusing one another. I think the best that, and I guess I'm sort of agreeing with Fred here, I think the best that one can achieve in a kind of meditative state is a full on awareness of that thought goes on independent of your intention, that there is a sort of source of streaming thought that is like the mirror reflecting whatever it's reflecting, and with someone being indifferent to whatever it is reflecting. That is, the idea of an unlooked upon mirror is the idea of a sort of meditative state where there's certainly something there being reflected, but what is that? Well, we don't really know because no one's really attending to it. It's the thought that goes on without any attention to that thought is a and it's different than thoughtless thought. I mean, there's a sort of achievement of a meditative it's a thought that I guess has a content, but the content itself isn't explicit. It isn't, I guess, fragmented into an isolated separation from the process of thinking and from the environment in which the thought is going on. I think that the separations of where the thought's coming from, is the thought from a thinker, is the thought from the environment, is there an environment and the thinker and the thought? I mean, I think all of these are just more parts of the fragmentation that could be unified in a certain way, but it's not that one would unify them. It would be a sort of ongoing process, right? And I think this issue here about how this relates to suffering is that I think so much of the concerns that I've had are, what do we do with certain kinds of suffering? I think that, if Fred in his video sort of made it seem like there was a balancing between what he was weighing on one end as the gift, and then on the other end sort of the burden, or the price, or the costs, or the hardships. And I guess from my own perspective, when I've talked about the gift and the gift character of existence, I mean the gift character is the very ability to do the weighing. I would never put the gifts on one side of the scale. I mean, when I say the gift character, I mean the very moral sensibilities that is the world openness, the very fact of the very fact of being able to think. That's the gift, because it includes negativity, and it includes the I guess the capacity to feel the suffering with a profound dignity that I think all organisms suffer, and suffering is perhaps inevitable with hardship and and disease, the ravishes of intentionless nature. I think that's something that we all have to deal with. It's the hardships that people bring upon one another. It's the inflicted the harms and the hardships that they bring to, I guess, to people both intentionally and unintentionally. I think those are the things where I would want to focus more effort, more energy to try to see what could be done by way of thought to help us become more aware of the kinds of harms that are inevitable and the kinds of harms that we really can lessen. And I think there is something about becoming aware of one's own thought, that the more that we're aware of our own thought, the more that we can see, um, I guess, the way that desire and expectation play into experience. um, and I guess also to maybe, it's not to give a whitewash, it's not to give some window dressing and to say, oh yes, everything will be perfect if we just learn to, recognize consciousness in a certain way. I think the more that we can see that it is the earth itself that is created, it is thinking thoughts of thinkers thinking thoughts about the world. It's not that I'm over here, the world's over there, and then I just think thoughts about it in a representational manner. No, the whole that is to be included when one tries to get at the origin of thought. We need to see that the earth itself, it is thinking through thinkers who have earthly grounds, and to that extent the thought itself is being thought by the earth. We're just a place and moment that it's manifesting. I think there becomes too many ripples and confusing fragmentations of thought, and again, this notion of consciousness. As soon as consciousness becomes separate from its earthly ground, I think more fragmentation happens, more problems happen. I don't think that there is any way out of suffering. I mean, I think, we brought this up before, but Dennis Gabor, he talks about when morphine was discovered, invented. It really ended public torture, because before that there was no way to get out of pain. Suddenly, when we could remove all pain, it became more and more important to try to do so. And I think there are ways of getting rid of suffering, but that seems to be a different strategy, to try to alleviate the suffering that's there. That's, through medicines or through drugs. That seems a very different strategy than to try to understand the human condition in such a way as to realize certain kinds of suffering that seem to be inevitable due to nature's hardships, and those kinds of suffering that people bring upon themselves and others through the fragmentations of thought, through misidentifications, through simplifications, through reductions, through isms. I mean, I know Fred had talked a little bit about not being an ist. I think istness, the more that people are ists, the more that they're fragmented in their thought, and the more kind of, as Krishnamurti would say, fragmentation brings violence. I think so much of the Krishnamurti Bohm discussions are about learning to observe thought. And the meditative thought isn't a contentless consciousness. It's not that consciousness is devoid of content. It is the awareness of the earthly or organic roots of thought. I mean, when we can have thought the way that leaves get released from trees, I think we're thinking in ways that are maybe a little bit more liberating. Okay, thanks.